After finishing with the spinal cord's white matter or the white columns, now we switch on to the blood supply of the spinal cord. So first is the arterial supply, then we will take the venous drainage. As we know, the spinal cord is 45 centimeter long structure, and it starts from the upper border of the C1 or the atlas vertebra, and it is the continuation of medulla. And spinal cord ends at the lower border of L1 vertebra. And this is the medulla, the anterior surface with the pyramids and the olives. This is the pyramidal decussation. And this is the inferior cerebellar peduncle, lateralmost part. This is the anterior median fissure, which is also continued on the spinal cord as well. So spinal cord is mainly supplied by the vertebral arteries, which passes through the foramen transversarium of the cervical vertebra. Then it goes into the third part, goes into the suboccipital triangle, and then from here the fourth part goes to the obex, and it unites to form the basilar artery. Which runs on the basilar sulcus of the pons. So, on the anterior surface of the medulla, the two vertebral arteries, right and left, anteriorly they unite to form the anterior spinal artery, which runs on the anterior median fissure. And this anterior spinal artery runs on the anterior median fissure of the spinal cord. So this is the anterior spinal artery. Which supply the anterior 2/3 of the spinal cord. Then the same vertebral artery gives two posterior spinal arteries which goes posteriorly. So they are the posterior cerebral artery. So they are two. Both are the branches of the vertebral artery. And if we show by the transverse section of the spinal cord, so this is the motor root. So from here the motor nerve comes out of the 31 pairs of the spinal nerves. So this is the motor nerve, and the sensory nerve goes to the posterior horn with the dorsal root ganglion. So a spinal nerve is a mixed nerve having both sensory and the motor fibers. So sensory are going to the spinal cord, and motor they are coming out of this. So this is the one spinal nerve. So there are two arteries. One is, this is the anterior spinal artery. It lies in the anterior median fissure. And there are two posterior spinal arteries. This is the posterior spinal artery, and this is the anterior spinal artery. And here lies in the anterior median fissure venous splendens, which is the gelatinous material of the pia mater filling the anterior median fissure, linea splendens. In this linea splendens, the anterior spinal artery branches they go and they ramify and they supply the anterior 2/3 of the spinal cord. While the posterior cerebral artery, it supplies the dorsal funiculus, posterior horn, and posterior 1/3 of the lateral column of the white matter, and the anastomose with the anterior spinal artery. So anterior 2/3 of the spinal cord is supplied by the anterior spinal artery. But this anterior spinal artery is not very much long, because we know the spinal cord is 45 centimeter long. But as this anterior spinal artery goes down, it becomes, its diameter diminishes. It becomes smaller and smaller, and the level of the lower thoracic level, it becomes almost very, very thin. Then to supply the whole of the spinal cord, the anterior spinal artery is reinforced or strengthened by the segmental arteries. And radicular arteries. So segmental arteries, they are 5 to 6 in number. And they are also the branches of the vertebral artery. As we know, the vertebral artery passes through the foramen transversarium of the all cervical vertebra except C7. So as this vertebral artery goes up, it gives the segmental arteries. And these segmental arteries, they enter into the vertebral column through the intervertebral foraminas. And these segmental arteries, they all anastomose with the branches of the anterior spinal arteries. And thus the blood supply of spinal cord is maintained by these anastomosing segmental arteries. Below the cervical vertebra, the segmental arteries, they are the branches of posterior intercostal arteries, which are the further branches of the thoracic aorta. They are the posterior intercostal artery. They are 2 or 3 in number. So posterior intercostal arteries, as we know, they are the branches of the thoracic aorta. So further segmental arteries, they come from the branches of the posterior intercostal arteries, and they supplies the blood the lower part of the spinal cord, they are supplied by the branches of lumbar arteries, which are the branches of the abdominal aorta. Abdominal aorta, lumbar branches. Lumbar arteries, they are the branches of the abdominal aorta. It supplies there are also 2 or 3 in number, the lower part of the spinal cord. While the lateral sacral arteries there are 1 or 2 in number, they supply mainly the cauda equina, so this is how the blood supply of the spinal cord is maintained by the anterior and the posterior spinal arteries, reinforced by the segmental arteries. Then, so these segmental arteries, they enter into the intervertebral foramen and they supply the spinal nerves and they supply the motor as well as the sensory nerves component of the every spinal nerve, and the anastomose with them. The radicular arteries, they are about 12 to 16 in number, and these radicular arteries, they also supply an anastomose with the posterior spinal and the anterior spinal branches. Out of this, one artery, which is largest radicular artery, and it arises between T8 to TL1 vertebra, is called Adam Kiewicz artery. This is also called Arteria. Radicularis. Anterior magna. So it is the largest contribution of the radicular artery, and it arises in the thoracic region and from the right side of the thoracic aorta, and it is a large artery which supply the spinal cord. Other radicular arteries, they are the branches of the abdominal aorta. So this is how the arterial supply of the spinal cord is completed, with the anterior as well as the posterior part. Now comes the venous drainage of the spinal cord. So whenever a question of the the blood supply comes, then you have to write both the arterial supply as well as the venous drainage. Otherwise, it will be incomplete if you only write the arterial supply. So in the venous drainage, So there are 10 longitudinal vertebral veins which drain the spinal cord and they surround the spinal cord As we know, the spinal cord is lying in the vertebral canal or spinal canal of the vertebra. Surrounded by the pyometer covering so the veins, they are present around the two veins around the posterior root, posterior spinal veins, and two veins, they accompany the anterior spinal artery. So they run longitudinally along the 45 centimeter long length of the spinal cord. Other veins, they directly comes from the substance, gray and white matter of the spinal cord, and they collect the blood. And all these veins, they anastomose each other and they form a plexus. Around the peripheral part of the spinal cord. But it is inside the vertebral or spinal canal. So a plexus is formed all around. This plexus, which is so formed, it is called internal vertebral plexus. Internal vertebral plexus. Or is also called Batson's plexus. And this Batson's plexus may also communicate with the external vertebral plexus, which is formed around the vertebra, the external venous vertebral plexus. So both are intercommunicating. So in this way, about 9 longitudinal veins accompany the anterior, posterior, and all the lateral side of the spinal cord. And these veins drain the blood, venous blood, from below upward. So they are going upward, and where the vertebra ends, we know what starts there, the skull. So these 10 longitudinal channels of the venous blood, it goes up, and these veins, they enter into the skull, which is just lies above the C1 vertebra, the foramen magnum. And here lies the cranial cavity, and this is the clivus. So carrying the blood from the vertebra and the spinal cord, these 10 channels, they enter into the skull through the foramen magnum, and they run on the clivus. And the blood, venous blood of the bone, that is the clivus, also join them. The veins from the clivus also join them. And we know this clivus touched by the anterior surface of the brain stem, that is the midbrain, pons and medulla. So this is the clivus, this is the foramen magnum, and here lies the midbrain, pons and medulla. And medulla is continuous with the spinal cord. So clivus touches the anterior surface. So the veins coming from here and veins coming out of the bone clivus, which is upper is half is found by the sphenoid bone and below by the occipital bone, and venous blood from the midbrain, pons and medulla, it also comes and mix with them. So all the veins, they get together here. And on the clivus, a plexus is formed, and this is called basilar plexus. So basilar venous plexus is found on the clivus. So this basilar venous plexus also lies on either side of the basilar artery of the pons. Then this whole of the basilar plexus goes into the posterior intercavernous sinus. Posterior intercavernous sinus, which is the one of the posterior tributary of the cavernous sinus. Posterior intercavernous sinus, it opens on both the sides to the two cavernous sinuses. So the